I did my PhD up in Alaska, and then while I was doing my PhD, I sort of had great timing because we put in the lowest temperature geothermal power plant in the world right outside of Fairbanks, where I was going to school. And I might talk about that a little later. And that's a small microgrid that does not just power, but heat and food production and swimming and all of the cool things geothermal can do. So that was also a very inspiring experience. Then I got to travel around to remote communities in Alaska and see if we could duplicate that elsewhere. Did that for several years. Then I moved back to Oregon, where my family is, and was a geothermal consultant for about 6 years. And then I moved to France, and I worked on a different kind of geothermal, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then I moved to Colorado about 3 years ago to work at NREL, which was my dream job. Little did I know that geothermal was actually a very, very, very small part of what NREL does. So thank you so much for your interest tonight. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about it. Okay, so what are geothermal resources and how do we use them? There's kind of three main applications of geothermal energy. And you hear people talking about all of them as geothermal, and they all are, and they all aren't. Geo-exchange is also called geothermal heat pumps, sometimes ground source heat pumps. And that really doesn't actually require any kind of geothermal resource per se. It really just uses, the insulative properties of soil or rocks in the shallow subsurface, by geologists' terms, to heat and cool buildings or spaces. So that is one type of geothermal. The next type is really not well known in the United States, although here in Colorado we might know it a little bit better. And that's what we call direct use. And that's when we actually are looking for, a resource per se of hot water underground that we can bring up to the surface and extract for heat. And that's why it's called direct use, because there's no energy conversion from the heat to electricity. The electricity part is the third type of geothermal technologies or applications. And in parentheses here are the temperatures of the resources required for these types of applications. So like I said, geo-exchange or geothermal heat pumps, also called ground source heat pumps, they don't really require a real resource, and I apologize for the Celsius here. It's a science geek in me, but you really don't need high temperature water or rocks to do that. You do want some hot water if you want to do some direct use of geothermal heat. Typically you're looking for water between 30 degrees C and, well above boiling. And then for geothermal electricity, it used to be that you needed boiling temperatures for your hot water to run your turbine. I'll talk about a type of technology that we've been employing lately that lowers that temperature requirement. Now we're saying 80 degrees C, although the project I spoke of in Alaska was actually able to get down to about 70 degrees C because it's all about that temperature differential. So up in Alaska, where it's colder, you can use lower temperature resources for producing electricity. So here's some kind of cartoons showing all those different types of technologies. They all require some type of drilling. So for the shallowest and coolest resources, they require, shallow drilling for heat pumps. And those can be horizontal loops or vertical loops. And then if you're trying to do direct use or geothermal electricity production, you're going to be drilling wells anywhere from 500 feet to thousands of feet deep. Sometimes even tens of thousands, but not too often. And so all of these technologies are really spelled out in a 2019 report that the United States Department of Energy came up with called Geovision. I show a little screenshot of the cover there. I really encourage you, if you're interested in geothermal, to look that up. It's just Google DOE Geovision, and it's about 200 pages just for the summary, and then it's got about thousands of pages of all the technical documentation. Pretty comprehensive. But what I will say about geothermal is that it is this underutilized, kind of forgotten resource that is closer to us than the sun. At the same temperature, the core of the Earth is about the same temperature as the surface of the sun, and it's closer. It is harder to access. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So like I talked about, there's kind of three major types of applications. And I talked a bit about the resources that you need to do those types of applications. So again, starting from the bottom and going up, we say there's no resource required for geothermal heat pumps. When you start getting into things like building, heating, and cooling, or different agricultural applications like fish farming, greenhouses, food processing, as well as industrial applications. Those actually often, most of these processes don't need extremely high temperatures or steam. You can meet some of those needs with low temperature geothermal resources. And what you're looking for typically is liquid, brine and water. And those types of resources are geographically more abundant. But the problem is, because they're not boiling, they actually don't come up to the surface very well, so they're really hard to find. Almost all of them are found by accident. Either we're drilling an oil and gas well, or if you're in Nevada, you're drilling a water well, and whoops, you get hot water. I heard that happen here in Colorado, too. So it's actually oddly more difficult to find these more geographically abundant, low-temperature resources. So those get overlooked, in my opinion, and those are a real big opportunity for the United States. I would say that Asia and Europe are really taking advantage of their low-temperature resources for decarbonization. We are not. I think that's fair to say. When you get up to the mid and high temperature resources, that's where the United States has been actually fairly good at discovering and exploiting them. So here we're talking about steam and liquid resources. Brine, because they have a lot of dissolved solids in it. They also have a lot of non-condensable gases. They can have complex mineralogy and difficult pHs. They're more geographically rare, but because they often are boiling, they have surface expression. So you'll find them as hot springs or fumaroles, which are steam vents. And those are suitable for, as you can see, for power generation, but also for hydrogen production. And so that's sort of the overview. Let's start with power production. So this is a map showing all of the different power plants in the world. And you can see the United States actually has quite a few. We're actually one of the world's leaders in geothermal power production. Geothermal power plants are really interesting because a geothermal power plant will generate up to 4 times as much electricity as a wind or solar plant of the same capacity because it's always available. It's non-weather dependent. So that's what we call high capacity factor. They work 80 to 90 to 100% of the time. And so that does make it a more, in theory, valuable source of electricity. And that has been valued differently over the years. But so, if you know anything about geology, you can kind of see that this map is broken up. In what I'm trying to say is the ring of fire doesn't show up very well here, but a lot of the geothermal power plants are clustered around the plate boundaries where you have, high concentrations of heat closer to the surface. There are actually a lot of power plants, like I mentioned, in interior Europe that actually use lower temperature resources that aren't particularly connected with volcanic activity, things like that. The history of geothermal power production in the United States is kind of an interesting one. This data comes from a report we put out last year on basically showing the capacity additions over time. So, there's some differences between the nameplate capacity, which is what a power plant is rated at, and then the actual output. But the point here is that there was this big spike in capacity addition for power back in the 80s that continued till about 1990. And then we've kind of flatlined. I'll talk about direct use in a minute, but it's kind of the same story for direct use as well. So we had this kind of geothermal boom about 30, 40 years ago, and we still have all those plants. Literally, we have never decommissioned a geothermal power plant in the United States. In fact, I don't even know if we have in the world. But there have been very few capacity additions. Back in the past decade, we've seen a bit of an uptick, and we're continuing along that curve right now if you extend it out to 2022. But the majority, as you can see from the pie charts on the right, the majority of our plants are old. They're 30-plus years, even 40-plus years old. And that's the same whether it's by capacity or by number of plants. When it comes to direct use, I didn't show the same graph, but it really is the same graph. Whereas I would say in the rest of the world, it has not been the same flat line. It's really been more of a linear or even exponential growth in geothermal. Direct use, so again, just the direct use of heat for heating purposes, whether it's buildings or agricultural or industrial users. The world leaders in direct use are, in terms of, just bulk heating generation, China, Turkey, Japan, Iceland, and Hungary. But then if you actually look at the use per population, you'll see it's mostly concentrated in cold regions, which is probably not a surprise. And so here's a kind of history of direct use. It's, let's see, where should we start? We'll start with upper left. The age of the GDH stands for geothermal district heating. We've got 23 systems in the United States, and just like the power plants, almost all of them are 30 to 40 years old. There's actually one in Idaho that's 129 years old. In Boise, it was one of those accidental discoveries of hot water by the utility called Warm Springs District. I don't know if it was called that back then. It's called that now, and they actually have 4 different district heating systems that are run in the town of Boise. And so there's 22 others. They're all concentrated in the west. What you see in the lower right is a heat flow map. And it's actually an estimated temperature at 2 kilometers at depth map. So you can see that the western part of the United States, because of our active geology and extensional tectonics and things like that, is actually a very high heat flow. Whereas the eastern part really doesn't have that same heat flow. And you can see that that's where the heating projects are. If you look at a map of Europe, which I didn't put up here, or a map of Asia, that's not necessarily the case, that all the district heating systems have to be in these extremely hot red zones. But these are what we call Gen 1 district heating systems, which are kind of old school, 129 years old. So they really are very simple. Put a hole in the ground, distribute the water. And there have been, I'll talk later about some technology improvements that have allowed heating systems now to run off of lower grade resources. But yeah, so the history of the United States district heating from geothermal is kind of following the power plants, where we had this big boom in the 80s. And I've overlaid some gas prices and oil prices there. So we can see, really, in some ways, it tracked the high oil and gas prices in the 80s. And then we had this other spike recently that didn't result in a lot more deployment. So that's kind of interesting. So, like I said, the west part of the United States has good hydrothermal or hot water resources. Right now, we've got 3 gigawatts of exploitation, which is, less than 1% of the country's generation, but it's something. We have probably up to 3 times that in resources that we've identified but haven't been developed yet for power. So that's kind of a low-hanging fruit if we want to decarbonize our grid. We also have, and this comes from a 2008 USGS assessment, we also have probably about 10 times that in undiscovered resources. So that is, it's projections based on, geology, heat flow, hydrology, things like that. And actually this year, they kicked off a new assessment that'll come out in 2025 that it probably is going to show a lot more than 30 gigawatts of undiscovered hydrothermal resources. So this, again, is getting to my point that I made before about it's really an underutilized resource. And this is just hydrothermal. Now, hydrothermal, to generate power from conventional hydrothermal resources or hot water, you need abundant heat found in rocks at depth. Okay, that's easy. The Earth does that for us. You also need fluid to carry heat from the rocks. And then you also need small pathways to conduct the fluid through the hot rocks. And those two are actually what make it kind of geographically rare, because the fluid isn't available everywhere. And then also, the tectonic setting of most of the Earth doesn't really allow for open fluid pathways to be sustained over long periods of time to allow this kind of like consistent circulation of hydrothermal resources. So that's why this paper that I'm citing here by Rybach says, this heat carrier, which is steam and hot water at depth, is only locally present in kind of rare cases. And so that's one reason we haven't seen a lot of hydrothermal development. The other type of resource, petrothermal, is really just where you have heat. And in principle, this is ubiquitous. But the problem with that is, so far we haven't figured out what would be the carrier then to get that heat from the subsurface to, be utilized at the surface. And so if you include petrothermal resources, though, even though we, conventional technologies don't use those, the resource base becomes just, it blows the hydrothermal base out of the water. So one term for petrothermal resources, petro meaning rock, thermal meaning hot, so just hot rock, is it's also called an EGS resource, which I'll explain in a minute. And you can see that's like orders of magnitude, more abundant than hydrothermal resources. So this is kind of a big reward if we can figure out how to exploit this type of resource. So that's where I get to this geothermal technology section. So before I talk more about petrothermal resource technologies, let me go back to how we typically generate power from hydrothermal. So we've got three types of power plants, dry steam, flash steam, and binary cycle. The oldest dry steam power plant was put in Italy in 1906. It's still running today. Most resources aren't dry steam, meaning they only have a steam fraction. Most geothermal resources, even high-grade ones, are mostly liquid under pressure that then gets flashed to steam when it's brought to the surface. So that's the flash steam technology. That's probably, for a long time, that was the most important technology for geothermal. But then about 30 years ago, a couple companies came out with this binary cycle technology, which allowed steam to be generated from temperatures that are lower than the boiling point of water. So they use a binary or secondary fluid that gets put through a heat exchanger with a working geothermal fluid that boils at a lower temperature than water. And then that allows less power to be generated less efficiently, but you can use lower grade resources. So this is I would say 99.9% of all geothermal power plants in the world use one of these three technologies. Probably the most abundant now is binary. Binary is also interesting because as you can see, it's a completely closed loop. So you have zero emissions. You have zero, you don't have any. Most of the geothermal emissions in a flash steam plant is water, but still you get some steam loss. So you get a little bit of depletion of a reservoir, for example. And there can be CO2 actually in geothermal fluids. So that's been an issue in certain sites where there's a lot of carbonate rock. So binary cycle is also now chosen not just for that lower grade resource reason, but also just to keep everything closed loop and to keep the system completely 100% renewable. Here's something you don't hear talked about very often, but it's really was something that my eyes were open to in Europe. And it's using hydrothermal resources that are very low grade for co-production. And when I say co-production, I mean co-produced with hydrocarbons, so oil and gas. Where I was living in France, they have all of these depleted gas fields that have, about a 95% water cut. So almost everything that's coming out of that is hot water. Or actually, I should say tepid. It's not hot. But they're using it for, heating high schools close by. They're using it for greenhouses, tomato production, things like that. And I got really inspired by that because especially here in Colorado, the U.S. has just so many abandoned and idle wells. There are more abandoned and idle wells than there are active wells in the United States. So if this could be even done in a fraction of them, I think that would be really exciting. The problem is, you really do have to find kind of the Goldilocks environment where you have a good, hot water resource that's got the right chemistry and also is, voluminous or abundant enough to flow up into your well to either generate electricity or heat. But I won't go into all the details here. But this was actually I took this from a 2010 DOE pamphlet that you can find online if you're interested in all of the details. So, this has been around for a while, but it's only just now, I think, starting to gain traction in the United States. And I think that would be really interesting here in Colorado because the Denver Basin, the Piceance Basin, the Raton Basin, they're hot. Okay, so I promised I'd talk about this. This is a type of technology that could really transform geothermal. In fact, it is being deployed right now. Actually, in France, where I was living, they're using it. We have a demonstration project in Utah, in the United States, using this technology, and then it's also being used at the margins of old fields. And what this technology does is it engineers geothermal systems where there aren't any. So instead of, using naturally circulating fluid like I talked about before, you're going to have an injection well that injects cold fluid, water, I should say, And because of, basically the fact that you're injecting cold water, you're going to cause thermal contraction of the rocks beneath it and cause natural permeability. So it's not fracking because you don't have introduce chemicals. You're not actually doing it. You don't necessarily need pressure to do it. Sometimes they use pressure, which is, in my mind, a bad idea. But because also geothermal systems often are in seismic zones. But this technology would really allow, utilization of petrothermal resources. So the United States Department of Energy is going after this as a real kind of high risk, but also high reward technology solution to get more geothermal on the grid. There's some other technologies that are emerging right now, and I put kind of a screenshot from, gosh, how many is that? 10 different companies that are proposing really interesting solutions that all have a different take on how to exploit petrothermal resources. A lot of them have closed loop concepts. Some of them are called advanced geothermal systems. And I won't go into it too much, but this is kind of like an emerging technology field. I wouldn't say that it's commercial yet. It hasn't quite been demonstrated and used yet, but there's, especially in Texas, there's a lot of oil and gas transition towards technologies like this with startups. Well, I would say probably the most prominent you might hear about is a company called eere that has a demonstration in Canada right now and also in Germany. And that's this kind of radiator shape down here where they're completely drilling a closed loop system at depth and allowing, conductive heat exchange to bring up hot water. In the Canadian example, I think it's just for heat, not for electricity. So let's talk about heat. District heating is something I talked about with Boise, that 129-year-old system. This is something I got real familiar with working geothermal in Europe. It's really, mechanically simple. Basically, you bring up some hot water and you run it around via pipes to a district of buildings. The district heating system in Paris, France is about 60 years old, and it's been expanding yearly. Every year they add more buildings. I think it services hundreds of thousands of users, if I've got that number right. And like I said, it's not, particularly high-grade resource they use. It just happens to be close enough to Paris that they can use it. You can also do district heating with ground source heat pumps or geothermal heat pumps. I'm not an expert in that, so I didn't talk about it too much, but I think it's a really interesting decarbonization solution. I show over here just a little cartoon of where the geothermal heat pumps or ground source heat pumps are taking off. But that's just for individual homes, those insights. If we were to rethink the way that we heat, districts and look at geothermal district heating from direct use, and also look at places that might not have direct use resources, but have look at heat pumps in those kinds of areas, I think we could have a major building decarbonization breakthrough. And I'm not the only one. There's a lot of people saying this right now. But it's kind of a tricky question because it requires a lot more coordination than we're used to doing in the United States. I mean, we're pretty used to this paradigm of everyone heats their own home the way they want, right? And not necessarily plugging into with all your neighbors and your city planner. And so we might have a little bit of a culture barrier there. But, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that in the United States, ground source heat pump use is more common in residential than commercial buildings, but that's really uneconomic, and it's not what the rest of the world is doing. Ground source heat pumps make the most sense when you can heat lots of space with them. As some of you may know, if you're trying to do it at an individual building level, it's really expensive, and that's why I didn't do it for my house. So, I think, right now they represent about 1% of the HVAC market. And I think as long as they're just a rich people solution, they're going to stay that way. But if we rethink it in terms of district, that might help with economics. I think I said all this just now. So in summary, we've got hydrothermal resources all over the United States, focused in the West, but not just. You can see there's some hydrothermal resources in Texas, Louisiana, all the way up through the Appalachian Basin. There's some pockets In fact, we're working on a project with West Virginia University. They're in that kind of blob, the first blob in the Appalachian Basin, and also a project up at Cornell University in New York that are trying to use their district heating, their resources for district heating. So we have a lot of hydrothermal potential in the United States. The dots are known hydrothermal systems. And then we also have a lot of petrothermal potential, and those are accessible through these unconventional technologies that I mentioned. Okay, so why don't we have more geothermal? Is that what you're all thinking? I think this graph mostly tells you why. You know, it's got, in some ways, a similar risk structure to oil and gas, so you need a private industry. Well, in the United States, you know, we think this industry should be in the hands of private industry, and the private industry players really need to have a high risk appetite, because what happens is you do your surface reconnaissance for your geothermal resource, and you're spending all sorts of money doing surface exploration for a resource you have no idea is there. I think the success rate is at about 8% at that point. Then you do drilling, where you're going to lay down hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars before you know you have a resource, before you know you have a market, before you know you have anything. And all that time, you know, as you can see, the risk is really high, and the costs are, you're already, you know, at half your cumulative cost by the time you've drilled your first couple wells. The problem is with that, unlike oil and gas, is that the reward is way lower. What do you get out of this? You get hot water. You know, that is marketable for maybe some electrons, maybe not. You know, if you just want to do heat, that loses its value the second you take it away from your source, right? So there's just this kind of mismatch in terms of who's going to take this risk for, you know, the very minimal reward. What is the reward? The reward is a clean, resilient energy source. Are our private investors going to pay for that right now? Not in this market. That's my opinion. So I think that is, you know, a lot of the story in the United States. Nonetheless, we do have companies willing to do it, and they go out and they do the exploration drilling. Then once they've confirmed their resource, then they go out and do production drilling. And then, you know, between the reconnaissance and the operation of your plant, you've got about an 8-year timeline. So that's actually another big impediment, especially when it comes to competition with other renewables right now. Other renewables, you can deploy them in months, right? And so this is, you know, geothermal really hasn't had the same playing field as fossil because of the reward, and then as other renewables because of that timeline and risk. So I think that mostly answers it in my mind. I'll dig a little bit into some of the particular challenges. So as you saw here, you know, in this graph, geothermal is really high on CapEx or upfront costs, and that's mostly because it's really expensive to drill. The drilling costs rise exponentially with depth. So here, this is the most recent cost curves for estimating drilling costs for geothermal. And actually what I meant to put in here, but I didn't get a chance, is oil and gas drilling. We are orders of magnitude more expensive than oil and gas drilling. And part of that is technical. You know, we drill in hotter environments, so we need different equipment. We have harder rocks, so the rate of penetration is way slower. The other thing is, I lost my train of thought. There was another reason. Anyway, you get my point. And I talked about the timeline. It's not just a matter of actually project development, but a single geothermal project can actually trigger, for one example, a NEPA analysis, which is like an environmental assessment, 6 different times. So that really puts us not on the playing field with literally any other type of energy resource, including oil and gas. So that's a problem. But that, I think we're working on. I think another challenge in the western part of the United States is that there's this perceived risk to surface features. So, you know, I'm curious about you guys' perspective here in Colorado. When I moved here about 3 years ago and talked about geothermal development, I was getting a lot of, oh, well, won't that impact, you know, our hot springs that we use for bathing? And the answer is absolutely not if you do it right, you know. And that's actually, that was my train of thought here, is that with geothermal drilling, you have to isolate your thermal source, which is, you know, hot and saline, from groundwater. And you want to do that for environmental reasons. Also, you don't want your cold groundwater mixing with your hot source, right? So you have to basically encase and cement your wells the entire way down. So you've isolated your thermal source from any mixing. But in the past, that wasn't always done, right? And so I've heard some stories actually in France and here and also in California where, people didn't drill correctly, and there was cases of groundwater mixing and basically destruction of precious surface features like hot springs. So that's a shame. But I think, if you guys can join me in the education campaign of just, this doesn't have to be like that. That's kind of old school. Nobody does that anymore. I think that would solve that problem. But, I think if it happened in the past, it's definitely a legitimate concern. And then, there's a lot of talk in the geothermal community about these renewable and clean energy standards that are happening state by state, right? In general, I see these as a great thing. Most people think these are a good thing. I don't know about the Colorado Renewable Energy Society, but I'm assuming we're for these. But the way that they're implemented, one example is they have kind of very constrained timelines. And a lot of times they actually tend to defavor geothermal development. So I don't really know all the details, but that's what I hear from my geothermal industry colleagues, is that these aren't actually resulting in a lot of geothermal development as opposed to other types of renewables. So maybe you guys can tell me why. I don't really know too much about it. But so those are the main challenges. There's others. But let's talk about the opportunities. So I think we all agree, hopefully now, that there could be more power development in the Western U.S. Here's, again, I'm citing a market report we put out last year, so if that's of interest to you, go Google that. One interesting thing to note was even back at, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, there were 70 projects under development in the United States, and in 2020, there were only 57. I think 2022, we've got less. So I'm not sure what's going on, really. We've got fewer and fewer developers in the United States. That might be part of the thing, is that, we had kind of about a dozen 20 years ago, and I think we're now down to like 3 or 4 major players in the developer space. But as you can see, there are a lot of projects under development, and they have been under development for a long time. So there's something stagnating here in the Western United States. Nonetheless, there is good news here. California in 2021 commissioned, they did a carve-out for geothermal. The Public Utility Commission commissioned 1,000 megawatts of geothermal and no other. And so that's kicked off a lot of new capacity expansions at older plants and also new exploration. And so, I think there might be some other, the reason California did that, as you guys probably know very well, is that they're having struggles with their grids now that they have a really high penetration of variable renewables. They need baseload renewables. And so, there aren't that many of them. And California has a really, really, really good geothermal resource. I won't go into this too much. There's a lot of text here, but when it comes to regulatory timelines, that is something that the Geovision report showed would make a huge difference. Just cutting the regulatory timelines by, I forget, I think it's half or something, would actually, just doing that alone would double the amount of geothermal deployment by 2050, according to these models. And then if you introduce improved technology, which are those new technologies I was talking about, like EGS, then you've got, exponential deployment to 2050, up to 45 gigawatts of geothermal. And like I said, we're at 3. So just those 2 things alone could really be transformative for geothermal. Another opportunity is for geothermal combined heat and power. So I didn't talk too much about that project in Alaska, but that was a combined heat and power project, and that's where you basically have a power microgrid. So in the case of this Alaska project, it was less than, at the time it was 400 kilowatts, so less than a megawatt. Now we're up to 680 kilowatts, but it's a very small scale project, but that's all the power they need in this remote community. And then they use that same resource after it comes off the power plant, still hot. They use it for district heating. of cabins and your resort, things like that. And then they use it for greenhouse. I think they have 3 different greenhouses now. And then they use it for chilling. So you can use hot water using an absorption chiller for cooling, which is really ironic that they only do that in Alaska. And so that's what this is shown here is these tri-generation plants almost exclusively are used off of diesel or off of fossil resources. These could really be replaced by even a low-grade geothermal resource, depending on what your power load is. If you don't need much electricity, who cares if you do it really inefficiently, right? So this is big opportunity space for microgrids, I think. And this is just a schematic we came up with for a remote or rural kind of case study. So this was based off of an Alaskan case study where it's, your fuel is flown in or barged in. And then so you've got these storage facilities, and then, that diesel is used for local vehicles, but also for your diesel generator. And we kind of explored what would happen if you replace that with a geothermal power plant. And it really would not only, get your little remote or rural community decarbonized, but it would actually generate a lot of economic development opportunities related to that waste heat. So back to that co-production question, I think that's a huge opportunity for Colorado. Like I said, these are some maps we came up with at NREL of DJ Basin or Denver Basin oil and gas wells. So on the left is just the wells. And then on the right, we looked at bottom hole temperatures, and those are color-coded by cold to warm, and the hottest are, up to 150 C. So like I said, it's a hot basin. We also tried to look at, how voluminous the water was in those. We didn't have the water data, but we used some proxies, and there were some wells that had both hot temperatures and, enough flow to be useful. So that, I think, is a huge opportunity for a place like Colorado. Martin specifically asked for the Sankey diagram. So I put it in here. The thing about the thermal energy supply in the United States is we meet most of our thermal energy needs with natural gas, which is what the map on the left shows, which, is a combustion process that happens at temperatures that are well above what we need, right? It's a very, very inefficient way to get a building to 68 degrees, is to combust precious hydrocarbon, at hundreds of degrees. So the Sankey diagram really shows how much rejected energy comes off. And this is both electrical and heat and thermal. But and I'm sorry it cuts off a little bit on this screen. You can see it better on that screen. But there's just a lot of waste in how we deal with thermal processes in the United States. And just contrast that to the graph above, which shows the cumulative installed capacity of geothermal direct use in the United States. And you can see, like I said, there was this big spike back in the 80s, and we've actually been tapering off. Since 2000, we've decreased all of our direct use. We've had a lot of fun with natural gas, but we all know it's time. It's time to really stop doing all that stupid rejection, right? And just to drive home this point, here's 2 different graphs that kind of show the same thing. But on the left, I'm showing thermal energy demand as a function of utilization temperature, and you can really see almost all of our energy demand in the United States is for water heating, space heating, and then air conditioning, which is done at temperatures where you can find geothermal resources especially in the West, pretty easily. They're lower temperature processes. And so I guess I've said this several times now, but I think this is a big opportunity, not just for buildings, but anywhere where we need process heat. Just a word on district energy. I know I brought that up earlier. The geovision study projects that we can have a potential increase in district heating installations from 23, which is our current number, to 17,500 economically. Those are just places where it would actually result in a net savings over, I think, the 20 years. So, there's another map that shows the potential that isn't economic. This is just the economic potential. So, as you can see, it's really clustered in the northeast, but then there's all these pockets in the west where it could also make sense. In Oregon, where I'm from, we're actually looking at a huge district energy and thermal energy storage system under the city of Portland. So the Pacific Northwest would be a great place for something like that. And the opportunity is not just new systems. We actually have like tons of district energy systems in the United States. There's one in Denver. Martin, you were telling me about one at Coors. I did not know about that one. This used to be the way we heated, right? Back when we had coal-fired district energy systems. A lot of them are still in place, and almost all of them are still fossil, and almost all of them now want to decarbonize, and they're calling us at NREL, and they're like, what are the solution? And, trying to get geothermal to be part of the solution here. It's not going to work everywhere, but if we can do it, at a fraction of these sites, I think that would be, a big piece of the decarbonization task here. So if you're interested in district energy, there's this great website called the International District Energy Association website, and if you can click on each one of those district energy systems and know what the energy source is and how many people it serves and, lots of details. Oh, one thing about geothermal is mineral resource, right? I mean, mines are actually fossil geothermal systems. And a lot of the brines actually have concentrations of pretty interesting minerals. So we did a study recently on the lithium, because for obvious reasons, lithium is a very interesting mineral right now because of batteries. And turns out a lot of lithium in certain geothermal fields. So if you look up the Salton Sea lithium, you might have seen some news stories about that recently. There's been some claims that we could actually solve the supply chain problem of lithium for the United States just from this one geothermal field. I don't know about that. I'm not saying that that's true, but there's a lot of lithium in geothermal brines, but not just lithium. There's geothermal brines bring up all sorts of, interesting minerals and metals, things like that. And so that's been something I think that's also been overlooked from the sort of market for geothermal. But it is getting attention. Another opportunity for geothermal is a green hydrogen resource. It's really interesting to have a baseload renewable generating your green hydrogen. This was the study we came out with a couple of years ago. We looked at every single renewable technology and kind of mapped the opportunity for it to serve as a green hydrogen resource in the U.S. And you can see there's, I don't really know about this metric of kilograms per kilometers squared per year, but I've been told that's a good one. That's high. And then the last thing I would say in terms of opportunities is that, geothermal inspired me in Iceland because it is really reliable. It's a local source of energy. It's always there. You've got 100% energy security. Iceland has really interesting politics because they're completely autonomous energetically. So it affects, everything. And the Whisper Valley community in Texas is a eco-village that has a geothermal heat pump district heating system. And during the February outage, it was one of the few communities that didn't experience any outage to their heating. And they had solar panels for electricity, so I think they had a 4-hour outage of electricity over the 4 days, compared to their neighbors that were struggling. So it is a resilient energy supply, whether you're talking about power, whether you're talking about heat pumps, all of it. This is just a graph that I pulled off of the Reykjavik Energy utility, which provides the city of Reykjavik with all of its heat, all of its hot water, and most of its power from one volcano east of the city. And this is their reliability. They operate at pretty much 100% all the time. So that's it. Be happy to take questions.
On the national map that had a lot of dots, there was one up in Steamboat, and I thought that said district. And I'm a little bit familiar with Steamboat, but I didn't know it. Are you familiar with the case of Steamboat Springs? Okay, thank you.
I'd love to hear. Do we have time?
I don't know.
Oh,
I'm amazed.
Pagosa Springs does have a district heating system,
Pagosa Springs does.
and
Okay.
I'm sure there are others, but that's the one we have in our database for Colorado.
Thank you.
If
It was a
it-
very informative talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I got a question earlier from a friend of mine, Ken Regelson, who, by the way, is making the jump to install geothermal in his townhouse in Boulder. He aches about the price. He told me it's coming to $35,000, which is hefty, but totally normal. So his question is, what are NREL and the other research labs and DOE doing specifically to bring drilling costs down? And what are the prospects for cost reduction? And I believe that his focus is really the residential scale geothermal drilling. And actually, I partially answered his question when he sent it to me and said, look up dandelionenergy.com. Maybe you can say something along those lines.
Sure. And I have a colleague who's a drilling engineer at NREL, so he should really be taking this question. But I guess I'll answer that in two parts. The first is, we have been doing kind of optimization around your typical drilling technologies, like looking at how to make better bits for hard rock and, increase the rate penetration where we can, and then also at the regulatory side, things like that. But I would say that that's probably least interesting because it's sort of like small little optimization pieces. One thing that actually you might hear about in the news is there have been some really kind of transformative drilling propositions that started not even that long ago, maybe 5-6 years ago, where rather than just like trying to hammer or have a rotary bit and mechanically get your rock out, they actually use either, some kind of millimeter wave or a laser or something that actually, cuts your core away and then brings it out. And that has, the modeling studies, because that hasn't been deployed yet, show that would really transform the rate at which you drill and then thus costs. So that's for... And the depths, yeah. The ability to reach extreme depths, yeah. But that is really not so much what he's talking about, where he's talking about the shallow drilling for single homes. That one, I would say both NREL and DOE haven't been that focused on it, and I think it's viewed mostly as an industry issue. And I think Dandelion is a company out of the Northeast that's attacking it kind of from the mass production type or, economy of scale approach, where it's like, if we can get... part of the costs are just the fact that these systems are so rare, you have to bring out one rig, and do your system, and there's no economies of scale that you get. And so Dandelion is working on that end, for sort of a market end, where you can do multiple systems in tandem, and you can...
If I may, I can just add something about Dandelion. Their actually main claim to fame is two things. One, they developed a drilling rig that can actually go between houses into the backyard and access these yards for the drilling. That's the one part. The other part is that they're actually combining all of these services. When I did geothermal here on South Table Mountain at my house, we had several different contractors. They all need to be coordinated to take their cut, and that raises the prices. And with Dandelion, they're managing everything from one location. And supposedly, they're able to bring down the cost to about $20,000, which is somewhat comparable to a high-efficiency gas unit plus an AC, because that's something I want to mention for the residential systems. You're getting heating and cooling,
Right.
So that's one big benefit.
Amanda, I have a question about the plan for northeastern Colorado, or I guess I should say the Wattenberg field, to tap the heat in the wells in the Wattenberg field north and northeast of Denver. And a recent agreement was made between United Power and a company to do that. What I have a hard time understanding is how exactly they will be producing electricity on this. Do you have any knowledge about this plan and how this might go forward? And one follow-up question on that, do we have any replicas or any antecedents elsewhere in the country that would be a direct comparison?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Thank you. The company, I believe, is called Transitional Energy that is working with the utility. And my understanding is, and actually NREL is working on that project, but not me specifically. So I might be a little short on the details. And it's just kicking off. But they are going to be using this binary cycle that I show here up on the right with a low efficiency. These binary cycles can. They're called ORCs, organic Rankine cycle turbines. They can actually sit on a wellhead and generate anywhere from 50 to 100 kilowatts, depending on your flow, and upward of that if you have better resource. And I don't know that they've selected, which vendor or whatever, but they're going to be using an ORC, I think, on depending on the flow, either a single wellhead or they're going to combine the flow from multiple wellheads and then be using that to drive the turbine with the, I don't know what temperatures they have in the Wattenberg field. Maybe you know, but I think, it's well below boiling, I believe.
Do we have any system like that?
Oh, right. So there was one demonstrated up in Wyoming. It was called Rocky Mountain Oil Test Center, RAMOTC. And it was a research project, but it basically showed that it was technically feasible, but economically marginal. So nothing really happened with it. I think it ran for about a year and then they decommissioned it. But I will say that, there's worldwide, this is happening. So in Pakistan and parts of the Middle East, and then also Colombia, are actively converting their, actually, I was going to say depleted fields, but that's not always true. Sometimes they're active, to geothermal, kind of low efficiency power generation. But yeah, thank you for bringing that example up. That's exciting.
Thanks for a great presentation, Amanda. Question I have is about the DOE's funding and emphasis and division of money among all the potential renewable and energy efficient technologies that the government deals with and funds. And it looks like geothermal has plenty of potential. Are there incentives out there for private corporations to start drilling wells and doing more economic and technical research to develop this resource? And so are there incentives is one part of the question. And then the second one is what percentage of the whole DOE budget emphasis is for geothermal?
Great questions. I should probably know the answers. I don't know what the percentage is for geothermal. It is not a high percentage of their budget. Mm-hmm. Absolutely not. But there is research and development funding. The thing is, I think it's fair to say that geothermal is viewed as a mature technology with the exception of some of the kind of emergent concepts I talked about. And so, whether that is true or not, I think that has then resulted in this perception that geothermal needs to really be up, it's an industry thing. It needs to be taken up by the private sector and moved along by the private sector. So, it's not fair to say that geothermal doesn't get research and development funding. It does. It's a low percentage. It should get more. But I think, compared to other countries, I would say the incentives are, we don't have federal incentives right now that really favor geothermal, with maybe the exception of what's called the production tax credit. And for a while, the production tax credit was at 30% for solar and was at 10% for geothermal. And then there was some reconciliation, but that's gone back and forth a bunch of times. And it actually, it's hard to apply because of our timelines anyway. So a lot of developers don't even claim it. So that's maybe one incentive that could apply to geothermal, but often doesn't. at the federal level. A lot of states, though, over time, less now, have had various different incentivizing, like California just had the 2021, direct commissioning. So, I wouldn't say that it's a law. It's very state dependent. And I think that's a point I didn't make but wanted to with this, is that state policy and, relative incentivizing, and not necessarily even direct incentives, but also just risk mitigation, really does have a huge impact for geothermal. And where you see a lot of geothermal development worldwide is where there are literally crazy incentives. Like Switzerland just decided that geothermal was a public good. And they fund all aspects from exploration to, commissioning of a power plant out of capital, public works projects. So that's just one example. Japan also made that decision after 2011 Fukushima. That geothermal, I don't think they called it public good, but it kind of fell into that same category where it can kind of, any step along the way of geothermal development will receive some kind of government support. So yeah, it's.
I just wanted to add something. The flip side of incentives is doing away with barriers. And one thing you mentioned that I want to underline, because I heard a big howl about it on Energy Twitter, are those NEPA regulations. Basically the howl was, come on folks, we're doing exactly the same thing as the oil and gas drillers with the same equipment and the same people.
Actually, we're safer. But
we have to run a rigmarole of regulations that you guys are exempt from, and we're just producing hot water. So that is a real big hurdle that needs to be taken, and it might even open up the faucet to stay within the metaphors.
Yeah, I know, I agree with that. And a colleague of mine from NREL testified to Congress about that about 3 years ago. And I've seen, I think there's better understanding of that right now, but bureaucracy moves slowly.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda, for mentioning the potential for using abandoned oil and gas wells for hydrothermal or for geothermal. And when I worked at ExxonMobil in upstream research, I didn't hear any talk about using abandoned wells for geothermal. Do you see any interest in the majors to approach this, or is this mostly startup companies and government labs?
Thank you for the question. I don't see much interest from the majors. They're, just startups and labs. Exactly. Well put. But, to be fair, it's such a different business model, right? Like, I don't see how selling, they'd have to get into the utility sector or the heating sector, right? It's just kind of, it's the energy density in hot water just has nothing to do with the energy density in hydrocarbons. So maybe it's not, there have been a lot of people waiting for that interest to happen. Right now, people think it might be happening. I'm pretty skeptical personally because I just don't see the fit, Chevron did have a lot of geothermal projects in the Philippines back in the 80s. They, certainly the majors have the know-how for drilling and things like that, but have pretty much exited the geothermal market rather than expressed interest in entering it. What are the barriers to using non-water working fluids such as supercritical CO2? I think that's SC. In closed loops, which is supercritical at less than 90 degrees F. Thank you. Yeah, so the binary technology that I showed here does use all sorts of different working fluids. And I don't know that there's barriers to using CO2. I think that is a commercial technology that's out there. I'm pretty sure. I'm not an expert on that.
Great. Hi, Matt. I'm in your same directorate at NREL. Nice to meet you. I'm curious, what do you think are the most important problems, or what is the most important problem in geothermal, and how are you working on it at NREL?
Well, I go back to those challenges, that the sort of risk and cost one. I'd go back to, the timelines one. And then one that I didn't bring up, but I think I've implied a few times, is just, I don't think the value of geothermal enters into cost calculations, right? Like I think that California is seeing that right now with what is the difference between a variable versus a baseload renewable. There is a value there, but it's not captured economically. It's not a cost that you can plug into to a cost benefit analysis. So I think that that's really had a lot of the benefits just be overlooked. So I don't know if that's the whole story. I think it's probably a combination of all of those things. And then, I mean, we've seen a lot of changes just in the past 5-10 years. I'm not pessimistic that geothermal might see a transformation like solar did in the last decade, just because it's not happening right now. Maybe it'll happen. Maybe it started already and, we're going to still see it. So, I mean, sometimes these things just rest on like the most precarious of little economic factors where all of a sudden you got the drilling costs down and now it's 6 cents per kilowatt, or 6 cents per kilowatt instead of 7, and then all of a sudden it becomes economic. I don't know. I'm kind of just spitballing here, but I actually would love to, hear other people's thoughts about this because I think there should be geothermal everywhere. So I've also often had that question.
You mentioned very briefly, you talked about hydrogen from geothermal. Is that hydrogen as a fuel that you're getting this from geothermal? Is that correct? And how does that work exactly?
Yeah, good question. So there's two ways. I mean, the first way is just through electrolysis of water, splitting the water atom. That's what most, hydrogen scenarios rest on, is using excess renewable or fossil. For green hydrogen, it's still electrolysis. Yeah, electrolysis using the water molecule. You split off. But geothermal actually has a lot of hydrogen compounds like hydrogen sulfide, H2S, which is actually something we have to abate for in a lot of geothermal fields, as well as oil and gas fields. And so one of the things we're looking at NREL is, can you split it's easier to split a hydrogen atom off of the H2S molecule, actually, than than the water atom where it really wants to stay. And so, are those actually maybe some secondary production of hydrothermal that we could, hydrogen that we could do from existing fields where they have H2S already coming out that they have to abate for. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's still, it's not really happening at a commercial level. What's happening right now is a lot of talk about all of the electrical transmission issues we have kind of getting solved by this, new energy carrier of hydrogen, and allowing hydrogen to absorb the, excess generation where we have too much solar during the day, too much wind when it's windy, and then rather than putting it into the grid or into batteries, we could put it into hydrogen.
Monday night, I got an email from somebody in Colorado state government that said there's a lot of new excitement in state government about the idea of geothermal, and wanted to talk to me about something I'd written about 10, 15 years ago on this subject at Pagosa Springs. Then I got the notice about this meeting tonight. I'm wondering, do you have any theories about what's going on in state government, why there's so much excitement now? Is it your studies that are triggering this?
Oh yeah, it's all me. No. No, I don't. I think. In Colorado, I don't know. I just moved here 3 years ago, and I'm still figuring out the state. But in terms of geothermal in general, I think that you can say that there's more excitement in the past, year than there has been for probably 2 decades. I think a lot of that is, as we get serious about renewables, we realize that we need baseload renewables. We can't just do everything with variable resources. We can do a lot, and we should do way more. But that's not. I think there's just sort of this all of the above kind of realization right now. As we really get serious about decarbonizing, we can't. What we're going to need all the different sources. So that's my feeling. But there might be something. Another part of it might be. It's getting better now, but the price of hydrocarbons was so low, and the oil and gas industry was really suffering, and the workforce was really suffering. And I think, I personally am getting lots and lots of interest from people wanting to come into the geothermal sector from the oil and gas sector. So I think there might be some of that too. It's just a workforce thing.
I was curious about two things. One is there is this Orient Land Trust in, which has all the thermal, has a hot springs, and all thermal takes care of all their electricity and everything there. And they're in the San Luis Valley. But they've been there for years, since the 20s. But I just wanted to mention that. And then the other is Yellowstone National Park has a huge amount of thermal, of course, and then there's Thermopolis in Wyoming. So between Thermopolis and Yellowstone, why aren't they doing more thermal energy stuff than you ever hear about? Because it seems geographically there must be a lot of places where you could get thermal energy between Thermopolis and Yellowstone. Obviously you can't get into Yellowstone, but right on the edges of Yellowstone there must be a place to drill. That's my question.
Thank you. I completely agree. I mean, Yellowstone's off limits. I go there almost every summer. I think it should stay a park. But the Yellowstone hotspot, right now is under Yellowstone. But it, just like the island of Hawaii, it moved from the west to the east. It's still going east. That entire spot is also, it's along the Snake River Plain of Idaho, is extremely high heat flow at the subsurface, and they have all these basalt rocks that conduct that heat really well. They have, I think it's 100 hot springs in the Snake River Plain of Idaho, and they do, I don't think they have any power plants. They do some, bathing stuff there, and they had, like I said, Boise has a bunch of direct use, but they could do so much more with that without getting anywhere close to Yellowstone. And then east of that in Montana, they could, I agree with you, it could be, exploited sort of on its margins. At Thermopolis, Wyoming, that's funny. Just showing one chunk of my background.
And not the one we need.
I'm curious about Thermopolis, Wyoming. I went through there last summer, and I was really intrigued by it. Yeah. Well, maybe we should all go take a field trip and see. No, I agree. I mean, there's so much potential. A lot of it, what I experienced in Alaska when I was consulting was a lot of it just kind of comes down to somebody being interested. And then you get a project going, right? I mean, you guys probably all know that, being in renewable energy. It's not even so much the technical feasibility of anything. It's just, do you have a champion nearby or not? So, I don't know. I don't really have an answer, but I agree.
The interest factor, I think, comes down to, is there a business plan? And the long delay times are an issue there. I remember there was a lot of investment advisories suggesting this 10 or more years ago. And I loved the idea, and I invested. And I'll tell you, it went to nothing, and they were supposedly operating things. So there's a little bit of burned last time that bites into wanting to put money in next time.
That's a good point. So the risk is really not to be underestimated. I think your success rate, like I said, from exploration is 8%, but it doesn't actually help that much when you go to drill your first well. I think that the success rate of your exploration wells is everywhere from like 11 to 15%. So considering those are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, depending on how people have really been burned. So that's probably a huge part of the question.
And I'll say that when I invested, it was already past the early risky parts.
Okay.
But one thing that came in was the very, very low natural gas prices.
Yes.
That hit when the fracking came in.
Yeah.
Natural gas had been high in 2008, but then it collapsed from like 15 bucks per meg, whatever, down to 2. And so it couldn't compete.
One thing I want to say to that respect, that geothermal is a bit of an afterthought. It's not a major player. Although, as you showed us, it's quite well established in some markets. I mean, like the Italian plant that's been running since 1910. That's a long time ago, and it's still going strong. So I would encourage people to take a little more a long-term view also, because it took solar 40 years from somewhat unlikely beginnings, and it's only taken off in the last 12 years or 15 years to now being the dominant renewable energy technology. So who knows what surprises geothermal will hold for us, especially if we get rid of those regulatory barriers, the unnecessary ones at least, and if we get an incentive structure in place.
And your point about drilling too is a big one. And there's a woman named Jamie Beard she did a TED Talk on geothermal. You can look her up. She's really inspiring. She's out of Texas, and her big kind of inspirational speeches are about if we got the full force of the oil and gas drilling sector, drilling geothermal wells, and like neutralizing the cost in the same way Dandelion's doing for heat pumps, could we get a bunch of geothermal wells drilled all at once and do it with the right, people and equipment to make it, orders of magnitude cheaper? That could be really transformative. So, I mean, if the geothermal interest out of Texas right now that is mostly startups could actually become, kind of bring in the full force of the oil and gas drilling sector, that would be amazing, I think.
And it would be amazing for another reason too, because the oil and gas sector is gonna contract and leaving behind a lot of highly skilled workers whose skills could then hopefully be employed in that emerging sector of geothermal. In fact, oil and gas has already done a lot of the work for us. They've characterized these basins, like the maps you showed us of the Denver-Julesburg basin. That's all well understood. Some of the data is probably proprietary, and you'd have to buy it, but at least it could be tapped into, quite literally. So with that, we have one more question, so let me walk the microphone right back there.
Yeah, I was curious, you mentioned earlier that there's a ton of existing wells out there already that have been drilled for the last 150 years or something. And you also mentioned that drilling for geothermal is a lot more expensive than drilling for oil. Does it make any sense to repurpose these wells and use them as geothermal, or do they not overlap the regions that are most ideal for geothermal?
Yeah, that's a good question that I didn't really answer very well. The devil's in the details. So oil and gas wells are typically about half to a third of the diameter of geothermal wells. So that makes repurposing them for hot water flux hard. So that's one problem. The other thing is that the geothermal resources are often, especially like in sedimentary basins like the Denver-Jules Basin, stratigraphically below where the oil and gas reservoirs are. So you kind of got to deepen them to even get to your geothermal resource. And that does have, if you're talking about active wells, that's one thing, but, repurposing typically is looked at for abandoned or idle wells. And so, deepening those, it's just been something that hasn't been that attractive to any particular industry player. But technically it can be done with the right well. You'd get lower flow because of that diameter problem, but you'd still maybe get a flow if you had a good resource. There are some places where there are, in Nevada, that transitional energy company that's actually out of Denver, they're looking in Nevada in places where, just kind of as a low-hanging fruit, where the geothermal reservoirs are higher than the oil and gas reservoirs, which just doesn't even make any sense to me. But anyway, and so that's where they're starting from, is cases like that. But yeah, it's not ideal. But those are already drilled, right? So your risk is gone. Yeah. Right. You have. I mean, your exploration costs are trying to buy the data off the oil and gas company. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Doctor, and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions.